Special Operations, Covert Ops, Espionage, The Team House, with your hosts, Jack Murphy and David Park.
Was there much evidence of foreign fighters in the Pech or Chechens?
Ooh, yeah, the mythical Chechen. Yeah.
The Chechens. Yeah, okay. Yes, there was evidence of foreign fighters in the Pech, always. I mean, there were guys like, of named specific ones. Abu Ikhlas al-Masri was the guy who was there for years. I mean, he was he's a funny case because he was foreign and he wasn't foreign. He was an Egyptian national who had come to Afghanistan to fight in the jihad in the late 80s, and had never left. Now, at some point in the late 90s, or perhaps after 2001, he signs on with Al-Qaeda, and he kind of becomes the conduit from Al-Qaeda leaders in Pakistan, the conduit for them to send material and money and weapons to support local fighters in Kunar and Nuristan in particular, because he had lived in Kunar all these years. I mean, he was essentially, people saw him as Kunari, although he was Egyptian. Mm-hmm. So he was always the kind of the bright flashing light in terms of a foreign fighter up there. But there were other ones too. I mean, they would come in and be blooded and leave and things like that. But we're talking, Arabs here essentially. Also, there are tons of Pakistani fighters who, from a Korangali perspective or a Kunari perspective, they're foreign. But they're not kind of, from the counterterrorism task force's perspective, they're not foreign. The Chechen thing is an interesting one. I don't think anyone can disprove that there were Chechen fighters in Afghanistan at some point. I mean, that would be a very difficult thing to disprove. But zooming in on the Pech Valley and its tributaries, there are many, many cases, where I was told, or you can see in documents, kind of reports of Chechens, and there's never anything sort of substantial to it. And there's a guy named Christian Bluer who has done a really good analysis of kind of how this the sort of the Chechen meme spread. And I think it comes from a few things. I mean, it comes from the very early days of the Afghan war, from Operation Anaconda in March of 2002. U.S. forces encountered a really nasty kind of contingent of Uzbek fighters during Operation Anaconda, who it seems were kind of mistaken for being Chechens. Mm-hmm. And you see this ball start rolling where any evidence of Russian-speaking people, of Russian language materials, documents, any evidence of sort of fair-haired, fair-skinned fighters, that all gets interpreted as Chechens. Mm-hmm. It often gets interpreted as Chechens by Afghan interpreters working for the Americans, who just use it as kind of a shorthand that they know the Americans will kind of understand, that Chechens is a word that kind of makes sense to them and gets their attention. It also becomes a good way, if you want Americans to come somewhere, you tell them about Chechens. Mm-hmm. So, for instance, in 2006, when the governor of Nuristan, Tamim Nuristani, is trying very hard to get the 10th Mountain Division to commit to building roads and outposts up into his incredibly remote province, he, of course, stresses to the commanders that he sits down with, he stresses that there are Arabs and Chechens up there, because he understands very well that they are doing this kind of counterterrorism through counterinsurgency, and that they intend to use their outposts as kind of these intelligence collection platforms, and that the idea of Arabs and Chechens is something that's going to catch their attention. Well, I'll give an example. I mean, I talked about this once with a Soviet veteran of the Pech, who had been there with an air assault battalion that would go and do big operations into the Pech. And he said that their equivalent of Chechens, the thing that was just kind of like catnip for their intelligence and commanders, was reports of Stinger missiles. Mm-hmm. And he gave an example of there's a battle that happens actually on the northern slopes of the Pech in 1985 that almost is as much of a scandal for the 40th Army, the Soviet Army in Afghanistan, as the Battle of Wanat wound up being for the U.S. Army in Afghanistan, to the extent that there are charges of dereliction of duty. There's a big investigation. But basically, a company commander follows a tip about a Stinger missile cache, and goes up, and the company gets slaughtered. It's just a disaster. I mean, it was sort of very severe casualties to the point that it was shocking to 48th Army leadership. And it turns out to have been a false tip, which you can tell, in fact, by the date of it. In 1985, there were no Stinger missiles in Afghanistan, but there were reports of Stinger missiles in Afghanistan. And these were already, whether they were totally false, whether this was a shorthand for other types of manpads that the CIA was already sort of farming into Afghanistan, like Strelas and blowpipes and so on. These reports of Stinger missiles, even before there physically were Stinger missiles, were a thing that just got Soviet commanders excited and could be used to lure them to places for various purposes. And I think the Chechen thing it falls into a similar category in Afghanistan. I think it's important to note, I mean, Chechens are not mythical. I mean, there have been tons and tons and tons of Chechen fighters in Syria. Mm-hmm. I'm not, but Syria and Afghanistan are different countries. I
have had conversations with so many people over the years who are like, oh yeah, our fob got hit. They were throwing grenades at us and stuff. They got right on top of us. They were Chechens, man. These Chechens were all over us, or any sort of halfway competent marksman in Afghanistan gets chalked up as a Chechen sniper. But then you start asking,
that's kind of the other logical fallacy that comes into play. And I've seen this myself in Paktika once in 2010, where I was visiting there's a 101st company that was dealing with a sniper. They call it a sniper. I mean, I don't know if he would meet any sort of American definition of a sniper, but they were dealing with a man with a bolt action rifle who was taking precise shots at them. And they were precise enough and scary enough that besides sending out, a team from the scout, from the battalion scout platoon, actually the nearby the Delta Force from their outstation at Sharana, not too far away, sent a couple of their snipers out to sort of help deal with them. And people would just refer to these reflexively as a Chechen, because there was this conflation of, we have encountered greater than usual competence. Chechens are known to be competent to a greater degree than we expect. Therefore, somebody who is unusually competent is a Chechen.
Right.
And I think that's something that you certainly saw. I mean, I would deconstruct this sometimes in interviews with guys who talked about it up in Kunar. You'd say, well, First Sergeant, you say you were fighting Chechens up there. He said, yeah, well, they'd get in real close. They were good shots. We heard so they're Chechens. And then that would kind of be, but was there sort of supporting evidence? No. We heard Chechen on the ICOM chatter. The interpreter said that it was Chechen. Does the interpreter speak Chechen? Certainly not. He's from Nangalam. So yeah, it's definitely one of those interesting threads to pull on.